this whole idea of why understanding trauma is important, I'm thinking that you probably think that I'm more interested in what's happening with children. Let's just make sure I've got this thing happening. But actually, it's more important for you because, see, children can't actually move forward if you're not there, if mentors aren't there, if loving adults aren't there, then, you know, children aren't going to be able to have support. So the whole point of you understanding stress and trauma is to build your resilience, your patience, your compassion, because this is not an easy thing to mentor children. Most of the children come in because there's some kind of developmental delay, because there's some kind of family issue. There's something about how that child is not responding in the general school community that has flagged that they need a mentor. So even though we may never know the details of that child's trauma or stress, that's not actually necessary. What we've got to do is just accept that it's there and know that for us, we've got to keep turning up. So, I always want to point. So this is a statement that's been made through a lot of science, and I'm going to read it out even though I know that you can read yourselves, because there's something about hearing words that actually sets them into our brain more. Children who are being or have been sexually, psychologically and or physically abused, or have been abandoned and or neglected while young. I mean, that's just, I've actually got goosebumps just reading that out loud. It's an awful thing, isn't it? And of course we know there are many adults that are suffering from the traumas that come from this cacophony of things that have happened in youth. And what science now says very clearly, this isn't just ideas or opinions, but things that have been proven, that children carry these stresses with them throughout their whole life, and that it does have really serious implications and can be a catalyst for turning on things with addictions and with mental health disorders and unfortunately physical illness as well. So, you know, this is a really important thing for us to understand. So what actually happens to the body when it's experiencing trauma? Well, what I want to do is show you just a little video that I think really encapsulates this beautifully. And it's from Harvard. They've got a Centre for the Developing Child, the most amazing website. And at the end of this presentation, I'm going to give Natalie the USB. She's going to actually put this into a PDF so that everybody that comes today can have a copy of the notes. Not, you know, take your own notes, because the notes on here aren't really broad, but it does have a resource list at the end, and this website is on there. So I really encourage you, if you're interested, to go. So we're going to watch this video.
This is known as toxic stress. Over time, time, this results in a stress response system set permanently on high alert. In the areas of the brain dedicated to learning and reasoning, the neural connections that comprise brain architecture are weaker and fewer in number. Science shows that the prolonged activation of stress hormones in early childhood can actually reduce neural connections in these important areas of the brain at just the time when they should be growing new ones. Toxic stress can be avoided if we ensure that the environments in which children grow and develop are nurturing, stable, and engaging.
So the really important thing to recognise from this is what science has shown us. This is not just somebody's opinion. And this is what happens from childhood. It can start actually when children are in the womb. We now know that when mothers are really stressed when they're pregnant, that the cortisol that is released actually means that the child can be born with elevated cortisol levels. Now that's pretty confronting because it sort of puts a lot of pressure on mums in their pregnancy. But it's important for us to know that that's why we need to do more caring and nurturing for our mums when they're pregnant, because, you know, it can be a stressful time. And now that we do know that this can affect a baby in the womb, you know, things need to start so early. So what they're talking about here is that their architecture in their brain, the parts of the brain and how they grow and how they're meant to develop together, this can get interrupted. Now, of course, everybody is an individual. And what we have to remember is that each person, the way that God's designed them, has their own unique set of genes and chromosomes. So, you know, that's your biological footprint. And that can't be changed. What can then be changed is nurture, or the environment that you're born into and you're brought up. So you might actually, you know, have these markers in your brain that predispose you to things because genetically that's your family's DNA. But that switch may never get flicked if you are in, you know, a loving, nurturing, just having a senior's moment here, environment. However, for children who aren't fortunate enough to have a really nurturing, caring environment, can be, if they're then in what's called a toxic environment, this is what can throw the switch and can mean that they then fall down the track of, and this is what we know can happen with schizophrenia, for instance. Okay, so it's not to say this is going to always happen. This is what we know can happen. Okay? Now, some of the things for us to understand as well is what are side effects of toxic stress. I'm sure as adults, some of you will be able to recognise these happening with people that you might know who suffer from a lot of stress. We now know there are a lot of medical conditions that are derived, you know, from having stress. So something for us to think about before we sort of get all tangled up into the stress and trauma is I just want us to do a wee review on what is normal development, okay? So that we've just got something so we can have a bit of a, you know, an understanding of, what am I doing? No, I've gone back. Okay. The beautiful thing about, this is an MRI machine, is that people lie in here fully awake. It makes a terrible noise. It sounds like some truck is going to run over you. The whole thing's going to fall to bits, and you can't believe that they don't know how noisy it is and maybe something's wrong. But while you are doing things, you know, they can actually take pictures of your brain and see what's happening. And it's really phenomenal, the knowledge that's come out of the use of a functional MRI machine. So what happens is there's this guy called Jay Geed, and he's been taking MRIs of children and young adolescent brains for more than 20 years. Okay, so now they've got thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of scans of children's brains, so they've been able to work out what is the average, what would we consider normal, even though saying the word normal and brain together is really, you know, a bit kooky. So what we want to look at is this part here. This is what we call your prefrontal cortex, okay? So this is the area of the brain that's responsible for our executive functioning, our problem solving and what have you. So what's important here is to see that when you start up at the top left-hand corner and you see that there's so much green and yellow, that's at 5 years old, okay? And this is the transitioning down age until this one right down the right-hand side is age 20. Now, it's through Gotte and Gede's work with all these MRIs that we now know that the brain doesn't actually stop developing, particularly this part of executive functioning, until you're in your mid-20s, okay? So, you know, sometimes we think, oh, you know, come on, you should know that. You know, this gives us a little bit of hope in some ways that, you know, there is a bit of a synaptic error in the brain. So this is normal, that it takes all this time for this part of the brain to be growing and developing, okay? So let's just look at the, backwards. So these are all the things that happen in this part of the brain. I mean, it's extraordinary. It's not a very large area of the brain, but look at all the things it's responsible for doing. Impulse control. Oh boy, but we think kids should have impulse control when they're like 5 or 6, don't we? Foreseeing consequences. Oh, surely you've got that worked out by the time you're 10. Come on now. You know, interesting, huh? Attention. I thought only kids that had ADHD had a problem with attention. This is telling us that this may not really get locked in until you're in your mid-20s. Wow, that's sort of a bit scary, really, isn't it? Okay, so what I want to do is show you this. Oh, I'm a back to fronter, aren't I? A bit dyslexic here. Okay, so I want to break down this part of the brain to show you, I'll have them both up together, that when we think about the brain and how it develops, the very first part that grows is this green part on the left, and that's your what we call the reptilian part of the brain. Okay, so this is a part where you can't control how your heart beats or your lungs go up and down and what have you. Okay, that part is what's growing first. The next part that starts growing is that little brown mushy looking U-shaped part, okay? And the very last part that grows is the blue bit that we've just seen in the previous slide. You know, this is all your higher level thinking. But what's really important for us to understand is that it is absolutely normal that in every situation, until there's been a lot of practice and a lot of learning, that the middle part of the brain, that brown mushy bit, which is called the limbic system, where all your emotions reside, your memories, your feelings, warm, fuzzy, scary parts, okay? This part of the brain overrides thinking when there is stress. Okay, so let me say it again. So it's normal that until there's been a lot of practice, like the SAS, soldiers and what have you, going ahead when someone's shooting at you, how can you do that? They are definitely scared on the inside. They've definitely got thoughts that are telling them, I should get out of here. But because of practice, they are able to override their emotions. But that takes a lot of training and practice. It takes a lot of training and practice for parents, not to sometimes clip somebody around the ear when they think that they need it. That's overriding your emotions. But this is a normal thing. It has to be learnt. Now, what we need to understand is that this is what's happening all the way through into your mid-20s, that this is a seesaw of learning that needs to happen, because the way God designed our brain is that the limbic system, that brown mushy bit in the middle, is there to code our memories, okay? It's there to store good and bad memories and feelings, okay? And so inevitably what happens when you're growing up and when you are learning, when you can have, let me give you an example. You can sit with a young person and have a very logical conversation about what's the right thing to do. And you sit there one-on-one and you think, oh, yeah, they've got it. That's just fantastic. And then other people come running in, something exciting happens, and all of a sudden, they do exactly the opposite of what you've just been talking about. You think, what's with that? Didn't we just have that conversation? Are you doing this to me, maybe? You know, because it feels very personal, doesn't it? But I was there, I was sitting there, and we were having this conversation. But what's happening is all of a sudden, some emotions happen, something good's happened, something's exciting, or friends arrive, or a pizza's arrived, or something else that means I've now switched to another part of my brain and I'm not thinking clearly anymore. That's why you have young people who say they know they shouldn't drink and drive, or they know they shouldn't get into the car with a friend when there's alcohol in the car, and yet when someone comes and says there's this fantastic party happening, guess who's there, and wow, 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 all of a sudden, boom, they're out in the car and they're driving off. And they haven't, you know, there hasn't been time for the thinking to really happen. So this is really important for us to understand, because as being grown-ups biologically, you know, because I own the fact that, you know, learning this has been very helpful for me and in my personal life as well as my professional life, is to be more patient, to understand, this is not a personal thing. You're not doing this deliberately to upset me or make my life difficult. You know, so that's part of the patience and the compassion thing. So just keep this slide in mind, that normal, and remember that this is been made up out of thousands and thousands. There's no just one thing. This is a continuum, okay? So it all depends on how fortunate you were in your biology and where you're growing up, and that someone keeps teaching you things for that part of your brain to actually grow well, develop well, and to have the opportunity to learn all of those executive functions. So now I want you to give me some feedback, because, you know, it's not fair that we should just use my brain the whole time we're here. And I'd like you to tell me, why do you think this is relevant for the children that we work with? You know? What's, why in particular would this information, do you think, there's no right and wrong answers here, why do you think that might be relevant? Why is it helpful to know these things with our children?
Sometimes I wonder if I'm achieving anything.
Okay, you wonder if you're achieving anything.
Because the inappropriate behaviour is continued and so on and so on and so on. So you think, what's the point of my getting anywhere here?
So that's really, thank you for sharing that. It's really brave to speak out these thoughts.
The knowledge that the brain is still changing means that what we do can biologically have an effect.
Yes.
Like in a positive way.
Yeah. What else?
I think what you said just make us understand why they do what they do. And as you said, so don't take it personally.
So break it down a little bit further. What about your particular children that you know and see? What are some of the behaviours that you witness? What are some of the things you experience when you're with your child when you come? Okay. Pull out a few more.
Tiredness.
Yep, another one.
Next week on top of the world. So 1 week really down, next week really up.
Giving up if it's not going their way, like a game or something.
Aggression.
Just flip that little lever at the bottom there and the board won't be erect.
The screwdriver. Okay, so we've got the inappropriate behaviour continues even though I've been working with someone for quite some time. They've got a short attention span, they're tired, they're up 1 week, down the next. They just switch off. They give up, especially when they're not winning or things aren't going their way, and we might even experience aggression. Do most of you agree with that? Has anybody had a different experience?
Also in that situation, my mentors are you become emotional and start to cry.
Very good.
Say to one that I'm going to pay or doesn't want to read anymore.
Okay. Yes.
Self-talk. Negative self-talk.
Ah, yep, that's another, yeah. Ah, so see now the things are flowing. It seems like, well, we're not all going along and having these lovely little hour and a halves with these attentively sweet, switched on. Oh, I'm so delighted to see you, and we're just academically booming along and, you know, okay. It's good to hear each other say these things, isn't it? Because it's really easy to think maybe I am doing something wrong, maybe I'm not the right person to be with this child. You know, these are the doubts that come up because this is confronting behaviour, isn't it? It's challenging. It's really challenging. So you've hit the nail right on the head. So again, what we know here is a shot of the difference between a brain that has been nurtured and the brain of a child that hasn't had any loving and stimulation. A child that's been in an orphanage and they just don't get picked up and cuddled. They don't have the, you know, how you look into a child's eyes and end up doing all those silly noises and faces and all the rest of it. So this is what the brain of a neglected child looks like. Again, here is a shot of a brain where healthy, on one side lots of colour, and you can see on the right an abused brain, and you see that there's just not activity happening in so many areas of the brain, you know? It's just like something's really missing there, isn't it? This is a slide that shows this particular hotspot here is a child, not this child, but this is the kind of face you get from children that have oppositional defiance disorder. I'm sure we've all seen that look at some point in time, and that isn't to say that that's what the child has, but it's just showing that there is something very different in this brain. So sometimes when we aren't quite certain about what's happening. We don't always, of course, have the luxury of having our child down for an MRI, but, you know, there are real implications to this knowledge for us. And what I would like us to think about now is this is really a new piece of information I've got. I was at a training with Dan Hughes and John Boylan last Thursday and Friday, and they come from the States, and they're authors of the most amazing textbooks about brain-based parenting, about how to support their whole work. One's a neuroscientist and one's a child psychologist, and you know, they're very, very knowledgeable. They've been working with traumatised children all their life, and particularly working with foster carers and doing therapeutic foster care for children that are significantly traumatised. And one of the things that they were saying that the studies have now shown is that, can you imagine 50 to 100 milliseconds? Like it's quicker than that. That the brain recognises a look on your face. So this is how, and especially brains that have been traumatised, the survival mode means that they have already recognised a look on your face and they've coded it and they've gone inside somewhere, 50 to 100 milliseconds. Okay, so I'm going to show you a picture. These are, when they do studies and what have you, it's accepted that there are certain looks that people get on their faces, and they've done this worldwide for, I guess, Anglo-Saxon, white, Western, you know, to Japanese, Chinese, Greek speakers. These are the accepted looks, whether we personally agree or not. This is sort of, this is the kind of looks that define happiness, sadness, fear, anger, surprise, and disgust. So I want you to hang with this thought. We're going to have a wee break now because, and maybe you can look at each other's faces as you move around. I wonder what that look is. Because this is something really important for the children that we work with, that they are so good at coding the look on our faces. What I want to go into next when we've had the wee break and just have a bit of a, because we're going to think about what's happening in their brains, but then we're going to get onto some practical stuff about what we can actually be doing. So we're sort of moving through now all the knowledge end of things, and we're going to go into some practical stuff. So, Natalie, how long